Hi, this is the character known as Jules. This video has been requested by a couple of different people. It's a slightly more advanced video, so I've included links to the Start Here and glossary playlists in the description box below for help with the terms and concepts that I use in it. In the States and Stages of Spiritual Development video, I described 5 states/stages in a particular order: gross, subtle, causal, witnessing, and non-dual. I also recently made another video that further splits these into 7 by differentiating early subtle from late subtle and early causal from late causal. But for the purposes of this video, I think just the original 5 should be enough. In spiritual development, we generally progress through stages in that order. But these aren't just stages of spiritual development. If you reverse the order, they correspond directly to 5 major states or stages or layers of reality that divine energy goes through in the process of manifestation. Pure divinity, which corresponds to non-dual state. To be clear, I'm not using the words divine or divinity in a specific religious sense. I'm just using them in a universal sense. Synonyms might include source, chaos, the absolute, Brahman, Wuji, etc. Polarized divinity, also known as the fundamental opposites, which corresponds to witnessing state. Causal reality, which contains, for example, Plato's ideal forms. Subtle reality, and gross or physical reality. Here are a few patterns that I notice about how these primary layers of reality relate to each other. I mentioned a couple of these in the Layers of Reality 101 video. In the order that I just listed, when you experience any of these layers directly, it feels more real than any of the layers below it. For example, causal reality feels more real than subtle reality. And if you're thinking that physical reality, the gross layer, feels more real than imagination, which is the subtle layer, perhaps consider the idea that you don't actually feel physical reality directly at all. You only experience it through how your mind processes it in your imagination. 2. If something is present in one layer of reality, it will also have a more fundamental presence in all the more quote-unquote real layers of reality. Every physical thing has a subtle essence. Every subtle thing is a result of the interplay of causal energies, patterns, and functions. Everything in the causal layer is some configuration of the fundamental opposites, and the fundamental opposites are combined in pure divinity. 3. The more real a layer is, the bigger it is. For example, we can imagine, subtle layer, many more things than actually exist in physical reality, the gross layer. And finally, 4. In the order that I listed, each layer of reality is generated by the more real layer immediately above it. Pure divinity splits into polarized divinity. The fundamental opposites of polarized divinity further differentiate to become all the patterns, information, processes, and fundamental energies in the causal layers of reality. Certain combinations of causal energies, patterns, information, and functions generate the subtle energies, patterns, and information, including everything from non-corporeal entities to thoughts and emotions to the information contained in DNA. And some of these subtle energies and patterns generate physical things. So these 5 states/stages are, in one direction, divinity manifesting, and in the other direction, our spiritual progression back to realizing our divine nature. This pattern appears to have been discovered over and over in one way or another in many, if not all, of the wisdom traditions of the world. It's not always 5 states/stages. Sometimes it's less, 3 or 4. Sometimes it's more. But the order, so far as I can tell, is always the same. In the rest of this video, I want to look at these main layers of reality through 3 different cultural lenses: Neoplatonism, Jewish Kabbalah, and Chinese Daoism. First, the Neoplatonic Hypostases. This is the system that I'm the least familiar with, so I'm going to cover it only briefly. As I understand it, Neoplatonism calls the layers of reality hypostases. It has the one, nous. This is where Plato's ideal forms are, the highest of which are 5 primal genera, megista gene in ancient Greek, or genera maxima in Latin. Psyche, also known as the world soul, and then the manifested world. The one sounds to me like pure divinity. Nous sounds like causal reality. Psyche sounds like subtle reality. And the manifested world seems pretty clearly to be gross reality. So far as I can tell, the Neoplatonic model doesn't have a polarized divinity layer. The Neoplatonist term for the process of manifestation is usually emanation, and the term for spiritual development is usually reversion. They definitely emphasize that these layers of reality work both ways. The Kabbalistic tree of life is a diagram of these main layers of reality. Please forgive my pronunciation. I don't yet know Hebrew. Keter, crown, represents pure divinity. Chochmah on the male side of the tree, and Bina on the female side of the tree represent the 2 poles of polarized divinity. These 5 sephirot in the middle belong to the causal layer of reality. Yasod, foundation, represents subtle reality, with, as I understand it, a particular emphasis on the subtle patterns and energies that form the physical world. And Malchut, kingdom, represents gross reality. By the way, there are some more or less standard English translations for each of the Sephirot, like Chokhmah is wisdom, Bina is understanding, etc. But I feel that aside from Keter, crown, Yesod, foundation, and Malchut, kingdom, most of these English translations run into a problem of being somewhat misleading, so I usually tend to avoid using them. You might also notice that these Sephirot have numbers. The Kabbalistic tradition also emphasizes that these Sephirot have a specific order that describe, in one direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the process of divine emanation to create physical reality, and in the other direction, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the procedure for spiritual development. It also appears to be a map of a particular layer of causal reality that I've sometimes heard called the inner desert. Note, you might hear me refer to causal reality, the causal layer of reality, or causal layers of reality. I apologize if this is confusing. I often find myself needing to make up new terms if I haven't run across anyone else sufficiently describing these phenomena. In the way that I experience it, causal reality is both a major layer of reality along with gross reality, subtle reality, polarized divinity, and pure divinity, and itself made up of other sublayers. I often refer to the sublayers of causal reality as causal layers of reality. The inner desert is one of these sublayers. When I see the inner desert in meditation or visions, it usually looks to me not so much like a literal sandy desert as a rather futuristic looking, perfectly flat plane of something black and shiny, like opaque black glass or obsidian. Sometimes there are various objects, features, and occasionally beings on it here and there that are also black, but I imagine that it probably appears differently to different people. This obsidian plane was the first way that it showed itself to me. I arrived there completely by accident during meditation. I had no idea where I was. It was a perfectly flat black plane and a perfectly black sky. There was one tall being there in the distance who approached as soon as I showed up. I got scared and left. Later, I learned about something called the inner desert and wondered if that's where I'd been. I got curious and went back to start exploring. I've since been there quite a few times, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. It feels to me like the backside of manifested reality, like as if it's the motherboard hidden behind the shiny iMac monitor. Although the inner desert is a causal layer of reality, it acts like a hub where you can access many, if not all, other layers of reality. It's a very complex space, and I feel like I've only barely scratched the surface of what I can explore there. Here are the features of the inner desert that I've either experienced directly or know through gnosis that I see represented on this map. Malchut. This is where I always first appear when I show up in the inner desert, which makes sense because I'm coming from manifested reality. The abyss is always behind me when I first show up, but if I turn around, it's always there in the distance. It's a giant crack in the landscape. It seems to go forever into the distance in both directions. And if I look over the edge, I can see no bottom. It also goes up into the sky. There's a gap in the sky right above the gap in the earth. And the gap in the sky seems to go infinitely up and extend infinitely laterally, just like the gap in the earth. You can see the abyss represented here on this map as something that's not there, where it looks like there should be a node, but there isn't one. Sometimes I see the Tree of Life map drawn with an additional sephira here called Da'at. Da'at is usually translated as knowledge, but it seems to mean knowledge in the sense that Plato defined knowledge, something that is experiential and transformative. Perhaps a better translation would be gnosis. I talk more about this in the video titled, What is Learning? What is Knowledge? I don't think Da'at actually represents the abyss itself. I have encountered an invisible bridge across the abyss, and I think Da'at represents this bridge. On the other side of the abyss is the region of polarized divinity. I've gone there because I was curious, but I get the sense that I went there before I was ready. I experienced it as both black and white at the same time, but I experienced it with multiple inner senses simultaneously. Visually, it was sort of like the experience of seeing black with one eye and white with the other eye, except, of course, it had nothing to do with my physical eyes. At the same time, with my inner hearing, there was a loud sound that was grating, like simultaneous tones that are not meant to be heard together. It reminded me of the sound that a modem makes when connecting. I could also feel these simultaneous extreme opposites in my subtle body, like an intense, very fast vibration, except that it was simultaneous opposites instead of fluctuating back and forth. I haven't ever been electrocuted, but I wonder if an AC current might feel like that. The experience was very disorienting and intense. I didn't feel like I should stay there for very long. And it was a little bit difficult to take my time getting back. The experience wiped me out. It took me about 2 weeks to physically recover after I fully came back to manifested reality. Oh, and by the way, when experiencing layers of causal reality, if at all possible, do your best to take your time going there and coming back. Make it like a journey. For example, really visualize yourself walking to the place and then walking back. This mitigates the shock to your system. I feel like it's similar to changing ambient physical pressure. When a person goes deep sea diving, they need to both descend slowly and ascend slowly to protect themselves from extreme sudden shifts in pressure. I feel like going into causal layers of reality requires similar caution. I have wondered if it might have been easier on my system if I had taken longer both to go to the region of polarized divinity and to return from it. I do experience gnosis that there is pure divinity beyond the region of polarized divinity, but I haven't tried going there. But the Tree of Life only maps half of what I see in the inner desert. As I said, when I first show up in the inner desert, I'm always facing in the opposite direction from the abyss. In front of me is an open expanse. Sometimes in this expanse are tall objects, scraggly dry trees, if it's the desert version, or obsidian monoliths, if it's the black version. And among the tall objects are all these grooves in the black version, or shiny rivulets in the desert version, winding across the landscape. I think these grooves or rivulets are life paths. If I walk straight forward across this expanse, about the same distance as from Malkut to the abyss, is the River of Death. I call it the River of Death because I see souls hanging out there. Some of these souls are crossing a bridge across that goes over the River of Death. On the other side of the river is mist, and beyond that is a mountain poking up out of the mist. And I can see souls in the distance climbing up the mountain. Gnosis tells me that if I wanted to, I could choose to see in the inner desert the entire process of something manifesting, pure divine energy splitting into the fundamental opposites, processing through the 5 causal functions, and then extruding through subtle patterns into the physical world. Living along its life path, and finally dying, crossing the bridge, and going up the mountain. And I get the feeling that the inner desert also wraps around in some sense, and that this could be how reincarnation works. So the dressing and some of the features of the inner desert can change from visit to visit, depending on what I'm trying to do when I go there, and possibly other factors. But so far, I always seem to show up in the Malkut location, facing in the direction of the River of Death. I almost always see the River of Death in the distance, and if I turn around, I always see the abyss in the other direction, with the region of polarized divinity beyond it. But both Neoplatonism and Kabbalah are systems from Western cultures, which could have influenced each other. So let's now look at an Eastern model. The Daoist Taijitu is the same map/diagram, just through a different cultural lens. Across the top, this is just the title of the diagram. I believe it says Zhou Dunyi Taijitu. Zhou Dunyi was the guy who invented this diagram in the 11th century. Daiji is the same word that gets rendered as Tai Chi in English when referring to the martial art, and it refers to the yin-yang polarity, which we will talk about in a moment, and Du just means diagram. So let's look at how this diagram represents the main layers of reality. The top circle of the Taijitu, called Wuji, literally without polarity, represents non-dual reality. This second trippy-looking circle represents polarized divinity. It is the predecessor of the yin-yang symbol, but I actually think this ancient version is a pretty excellent representation of what the polarized divinity region on the other side of the abyss is actually like to experience. Looking at it gives me optical illusions and makes my eyes feel like they're vibrating. The characters on either side say yin jing, which means yin stillness, and yang dong, which means yang movement. Yin and yang are the Taoist terms for the fundamental opposites. Yin corresponds to female. I believe these characters on the right say kun dao cheng ni. The kun path forms the female. Kun is the feminine principle, and yang corresponds to male. I think these characters on the left say Qian Dao Cheng Nan. The Qian path forms the male. Qian is the masculine principle. So this map shows yin, feminine, on the right side, and yang, masculine, on the left side, which is horizontally reversed from the Kabbalistic tree of life. In my experience so far, I haven't noticed the inner desert having a yin/feminine side and a yang/masculine side in any sense. So this decision in each map to place yin/feminine on one side and yang/masculine on another might be simply a symbolic way to show that the opposites are separated from each other after non-dual stage, or it might be a completely arbitrary side effect of wanting to be able to show which of these causal functions in the middle here are yin/feminine, which are yang/masculine, and which is neither, which I intend to discuss in another video. And or it may represent something else that I'm as yet unaware of. So this brings us to the 5 causal functions represented in the center of the diagram. These Chinese characters are shui, water, the wonderfully onomatopoeic huo, fire, tu, earth, another great onomatopoeia, jin, metal, and mu, wood. You might recognize these as the Chinese 5 elements or phases, which in modern times are represented as a pentagram, but originally were laid out like this, which looks awfully similar to how the central 5 Sephirot are laid out in the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. The 5 nodes in the center of each of these maps do have direct one-to-one correspondences with each other, but this is a complex topic for that other future video that I'm planning. The penultimate circle represents the subtle layer of reality, where specific patterns are formed. My clue to this is again these phrases on either side. The Kun path forms the female, and the Qian path forms the male. This indicates to me that the patterns at this level would be different for example, a female human versus a male human versus a non-binary human, which is consistent with the subtle layer of reality. And finally, the last circle represents the physical world. My indication of this is this last Chinese sentence here, which I believe is probably meant to be read right to left. Wen wu hua sheng, which would translate as something like the 10,000 things transform into life, or maybe all things transform and are born. As I understand it, like the Neoplatonist Hypostases and the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, in the Daoist tradition, the Taijitu map is also intended to describe both the process of Wuji becoming the 10,000 things manifestation and the reverse process of returning to Wuji, spiritual development. So, I posit that the one, Keter, and Wuji represent divinity or non-dual state slash stage slash reality. Chokhmah equals yang, and Bina equals yin, which together comprise polarized divinity, which corresponds to witnessing state slash stage. Nous equals causal state slash stage slash reality, and its primal genera, which I mentioned but haven't put on the diagram, correspond with the middle 5 Sephirot and the Daoist 5 faces. Psyche, Yesod, and the penultimate circle of the Taijitu represent the subtle stage of state slash stage and layer of reality, and the manifested world, Malchut, and the bottom circle of the Taijitu, the 10,000 things, represent gross state slash stage slash reality. And I think it's clear that each of these cultural systems maps the main layers of reality, the emanation of divine energy through successive stages to physical manifestation, and if that process is followed backwards, successive stages of spiritual development.